Hi everyone, Logan Hertz here with Hazeltine LLC. We're going a little bit off the beaten path here today with my friend, creative Pyung Kim, who works in technology. He's over on the West Coast and he's done a lot of writing, much more creative type than me. We've had a lot of interesting conversations, and one of the things I've learned in this business is the importance of human psychology as it relates to finance. And so, with that as the guide, we're going to have a conversation about psychology just more generally. It may or may not tie into finance, but Pyung is a good friend of mine. And of all the people I've spoken with, he's had some of those valuable, insightful things to say on this topic. So I thought we'd bring him on board. There is an article I'm going to use for the frame of this conversation on the four temperaments. And I don't think I have permission to share the article, so I won't share it, but I will be quoting from it. But first of all, Pyung, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks, Logan. Thanks for having me. And yes, I do feel like we've had very interesting conversations. I know that any of our discussions about the four temperaments and of personality types have been really, we relate to each other because we're similar in many ways.
I think so. For those of you who don't know, um, the four temperaments, we'll just start there. This could be a whole course in itself. So I'm going to very briefly introduce them and then we'll have a freewheeling conversation about it and maybe how it ties into finance, maybe not. So I've learned as a creator, you have to say things that are relevant to your audience and your business, but sometimes you create episodes that are just for you, the things that you're interested in that maybe your audience doesn't care about. But the four temperaments are choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic. These were discovered by the ancient Greeks and are still irrelevant today. They are a description of what we call your temperament, which is different from your personality. And there's a lot of different ways we could describe them, but in general, it's about how you respond to external stimuli. A choleric responds very strongly, and it's a very long lasting reaction to any stimuli. A sanguine also responds very strongly, but it's a short lasting reaction. It doesn't last very long. A melancholic does not respond strongly in the moment. They don't respond quickly, but it can be a long lasting reaction. And a phlegmatic doesn't respond very strongly. And even if they do, it typically doesn't last very long. Just to give a general overview, cholerics are your stereotypical leaders, very headstrong, natural leaders, take charge kind of people. Sanguines are your social butterflies. They're very friendly, very chatty, very superficial. Melancholics are quiet, introverted, thoughtful, deep thinkers. And then phlegmatics are similar, but in kind of a different way. Generally, sanguines and cholerics are extroverted, and melancholics and phlegmatics are introverted. And I should also point out, most people are not just one temperament. You're a mix of the four, but there's one temperament that predominates. I am a melancholic. My guess is that Pyong is also a melancholic, um, and that's where I wanted to start the conversation. So, Pyong, with that very broad introduction, is there anything you want to jump into first?
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out these are all frameworks. What's interesting about the four temperaments, and Logan, you're the one who I'd heard of them before, but I was more familiar with other modern frameworks like the big five personality traits or even Enneagrams, which is kind of like the latest buzz. But what I love about the four temperaments, which you introduced me to, is it feels it more, these things can get very complicated quickly. And especially when you're trying to map these frameworks to each other, because they essentially try to describe people in a low resolution way across different dimensions. But what I like about the four temperaments is it seems more primordial. They show up in myths, they're archetypes in the Bible, and they're so much easier to get my arms around. And they do encompass everything you find when it comes to people. And like you said, this is just a framework. Just because you're primarily one doesn't mean you're solely that one. You can exhibit traits of all the other ones, like you said. I found it very helpful. And when it comes to finance, or really more broadly business, they can map pretty well to what are often talked about as different management or leadership styles. It's pretty intuitive how they might map. The sanguine might be a charismatic or visionary. leader who energizes and galvanizes people. The choleric might be a decisive, results-oriented type of operator. The melancholic might be the quieter, analytical, measure twice, cut once type of person who always thinks about risk. That's primarily, believe me. And the phlegmatic might be more of the steady, calm leader who avoids hard calls. And without getting too into it, we can, if you'd like. I also have ideas on how each of those are the strengths, but like any strengths, they also come with the liabilities and the weaknesses. How would you characterize as a self-described primarily melancholic? What are the strengths of the melancholic in a business setting, and what are the liabilities?
Yeah, that was a great description, and I love that word you used, primordial. I think that's a great way of describing these, because many of what we have today are just copies or derived from what the ancient Greeks discovered with the temperament. So if you've heard of disc today, disc is basically just a copy of the four
Right.
temperaments, and they focus a little bit more on communication styles. One of the melancholic's biggest and most underrated, underappreciated strengths is listening. Melancholics are excellent listeners, and they can get a lot out of listening to other people. One of their biggest weaknesses is they tend to be pushovers. They're easily bullied, easily manipulated because they hate conflict. They are not necessarily the best when you have to deal with another strong personality. They tend to shy away from that. They want to shy away from conflict. But that can also be one of their biggest strengths because melancholics are diplomatic. One of the big compliments I got in the working world was that I'm a bridge builder, which is funny because I never thought of myself that way. A melancholic doesn't come across as someone who's friendly because they're very introverted and quiet. They're not smiling all the time. That's not who they are. But in a professional environment, they're even better because you don't need a cheerleader who's smiling all the time in a professional environment. That's not what's really going to build bridges. Whereas a melancholic doesn't get involved in the office politics. They're not into that. So they can be more objective and they listen and they're not interested in playing politics. Whereas a choleric can very easily get his ego involved in his agenda and pushing it. Biggest a melancholic's biggest weakness, generally speaking, is their cowardice. Their biggest strength is probably their compassion for other people, their listening, and they are deep thinkers. You called them analytical. That's true. More than that, they are really big picture focused. Because there are people who are analytical to a fault where they get lost in details, and melancholics can do that too. But St. Thomas Aquinas was your stereotypical melancholic. He's focused on the most important questions. He doesn't get distracted by numbers or because I see people analysis paralysis, right? They get distracted by information that is not important. Um, and a choleric sometimes thinks of himself as a big picture person, but they're really not like a melancholic. A choleric is very practical, and that's good, but it sometimes means the choleric misses the bigger picture, whereas the melancholic is not satisfied with a superficial explanation. They really want to dive deep into what it actually is and understand it at a deep level. Sanguines are the opposite. Sanguines will toy around and flit around and they love playing with this and then play with that and then play with this and then play with that. And then after 5 minutes, they're bored and they move on to the next thing. Melancholic is the opposite. It's really hard to get him interested. But if you can get him interested, he's going to go deep and learn everything about it.
That's very well said. And I can tell that you've thought about this a lot. And something that I really love about the four temperaments is, and frameworks in general, they're not only useful in navigating life and business, but it's a great tool to understand the self and gut check yourself on where you need to watch out for the vulnerabilities or the faults, because we all have them. We all have the strengths too. So like you're saying, and we focused on our primary archetype, although that's not all we are, of course, but some of the liabilities of being sanguine are, as you touched on, distractible. You can be impulsive or maybe even overpromise. You're over enthusiastic maybe. The choleric can be domineering, impatient, blunt. We see this in our professional interactions all the time. These are the biggest grievances we have with each other. They map almost exactly to these vulnerabilities. The phlegmatic can be at their worst indecisive or conflict avoidant, or maybe even coast or be complacent. What I love is
Right.
Logan mentioned that I'm a creative. Specifically, my favorite medium is writing. By trade, for many years, I was a writer and I still do that today. But as a storyteller, I think a lot about myths because this is a framework that is from the ancient Greeks. It's funny that it comes from the four humors. We don't think of things in that way anymore. But you can see this showing up in the Bible, as we mentioned before. Who might be a leader or figure in the Bible that's most melancholic? Moses, probably. So seen through that lens, Moses struggled with self-doubt and hesitation, but his strength was that he was introspective and he led from that quiet energy. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I want to talk about the interaction between, let's say, a choleric and a melancholic. This is where I'm going to have maybe a little bit of catharsis because over my time, I've interacted with cholerics and come to see the weaknesses of cholerics as well as the strengths. I'm going to read from this article about the choleric temperament. I'm going to quote at length because I think it's worth quoting at length, and then I'll let you respond, Pyung, because I think this is something we've spoken about in the past. So, the choleric engages the world in this summary fashion. If only these people or this situation were different, I'd finally be satisfied slash happy. The choleric, too, has a strange fantasy of controlling all reality that exists outside of the self in order not to address deep internal struggles with sin or imperfections. The tendency on the part of the choleric is to be consistently and almost exclusively oriented to the world outside of the soul. What is wrong with the church, society, my spouse, children, etc., is of the utmost import. The choleric is a fixer and repairer, or at least a critic of all things external to the self. The deception on the part of the choleric is to believe that control the environment outside the body and soul is the means to make the world a better place and even to achieve holiness. I'm going to skip a little bit. Choleric internal logic finds thousands of rationalizations why one is not to humble oneself. It manages to explain away the need to apologize or admit personal failure or being incorrect. If an admission is made, it is always accompanied by extenuating circumstances or a reason to minimize its negative impact on others. If the choleric is still pressed to admit his error or sin, he plays the victim. By this, I mean that he first usually attempts to put the problem on the other. You're at fault, inadequate, deficient, etc. If this subterfuge fails and he must take responsibility, he might accept it only with a series of rationalizations. The result is often a convoluted apology meant to minimize the evil, not to humble the self. The last resort, if this doesn't work, is the pathetic, I'm really the victim here, not you. The choleric goes on tirades about how it was a hard day at work or home, that he or she shoulders everyone's burdens, and various other distractive techniques to avoid responsibility for his own actions. In marriage, the choleric is one who has little regard for the passions of others, husband, wife, or children. Their emotions are dismissed, ignored, or minimized. This is a way to prevent inconveniencing the self in order to will the true good for the other. Since the choleric always has the answer, he presumes to know what is good for the other instantaneously and avoids listening, counsel, or the exchange of ideas. The choleric struggles with being inconvenienced and is very demanding of others. Always, of course, there are so many choleric reasons why this is just or correct. Pride sails the vessel of the choleric. The choleric seems to embrace Nietzsche's will to power with natural ease. I am writing here for the choleric who may now be noticing resistant bones in the body saying, that's not me. I'm not a monster. This is a silly caricature. It wouldn't be surprising if there is the temptation to go to his melancholic spouse or child in order to get a coached response that indeed this description does not apply to him. And I'll stop right there. That was more about the weaknesses of the choleric, but it was interesting how the article went into the interaction between the choleric and the melancholic, because I think oftentimes melancholics, whether consciously or subconsciously, can end up enabling the choleric in his faults because we want to avoid conflict. And we know if we point out the truth to the choleric, we're going to get our heads taken off. So I'll
Yeah,
stop there. That was a lot, but Pyung, do you have
I believe.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was great, and it is worth focusing on, yeah, especially as a storyteller, because when you're telling a story, whether it's a narrative or whether it's a branding exercise or even telling a story to a person about how something went down, it's often framed in terms of conflict. And the combination of melancholic and choleric is arguably the most explosive. and makes for the spiciest conflicts for all the reasons that you detailed. Melancholics and cholerics trigger each other like no other. For example, from a neutral place, cholerics will trigger melancholics by rushing or dismissing details, using blunt language or pressure, and melancholics will retreat to perfectionism, criticism, slowing down. All of these things trigger the other. Melancholics will trigger the choleric by endless caveats and what a choleric might say, not ready vibes, spiking the things that trigger them most, which is their impatience and their steamrolling, and they react in the choleric fashion, which is being more commanding and more terse, which the melancholic does not respond well to. These are things that are good to understand because it could help to guide us to more harmonious interactions.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think there's a between the melancholic and the choleric where the thing a choleric probably hates most is another choleric, not a melancholic. Because the choleric always wants to be in charge, always wants to have the spotlight. The melancholic has no interest in that. So there's no competition there. I have found in the working world, there were some cholerics that I worked very well with. It was a complementary relationship because a melancholic is an excellent right-hand man. He doesn't want the spotlight. He doesn't care who gets credit, but the choleric wants all those things. And so the choleric likes that, and that can work well as long as the choleric also respects the melancholic's opinion, because cholerics like to surround themselves with yes men. But I think the most explosive is a choleric and another choleric, right? That's probably the most explosive one because they both want to be in charge. They're both going to get angry and take offense easily. The way I would say it is this: the choleric's problem is he loves himself too much. The melancholic's problem is he doesn't love himself enough. That's the interesting point that this article gets into more. It starts with the great commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. And in that, the choleric needs to focus on his neighbor because the choleric tends to look down on his neighbor, not see any value in him, just manipulate him and just use him. So he needs to work hard to humble himself and see the value in other people. A melancholic needs to focus on himself, which kind of goes counter to what we think of because we don't want to be selfish. We don't want to be self-absorbed. That's true, but we actually do need to love ourselves and have true self-knowledge. And the reason why melancholics are doormats is because they don't love themselves. They subconsciously don't believe they're worthy of respect, and they don't believe they're worth standing up for. So they don't stand up for themselves. And they'll rationalize it as I'm being charitable when really, no, you're actually being a coward and you're enabling the bully. And I'll nuance it even a bit more because I'm being imprecise when I say the choleric loves himself too much. It's actually not true because it's impossible to love yourself too much. True love, properly understood, is always a good thing. And there's no such thing as too much of it. So what the choleric actually does is he creates a fantasy version of himself that doesn't exist. And he falls in love with that, not himself as he actually exists with all his flaws and weaknesses and pride. He doesn't want to admit that person exists. And when you point to the real choleric as he actually exists, he gets super angry and has a knee-jerk emotional reaction. So the choleric's problem isn't technically that he loves himself too much. It's that he's fallen in love with a fantasy version of himself. And God doesn't love that person because that person doesn't exist.
I would agree with that. And that's an important nuance. What's interesting is in that very high level, overly simple maybe way, it could be said that one loves the self too much, the other doesn't love themselves enough. But the preponderance of therapists and modern psychology would suggest that we all have trouble loving ourselves. And I agree with you that it's not possible for one to love themselves too much if you're going to be loyal to what love really should be. But yeah, I think that can be true. That nuance where healthy cholerics are genuinely more self-assured, I would agree. It's not that they love themselves more and they're more mission-driven, while the unhealthy ones are actually using their force and their bluster as an armor or a defense mechanism, really,
Correct.
to cover up insecurity or shame. So that's actually a lack of self-love.
The choleric has to be right. In the article later goes into that. The reason why the choleric is so argumentative and attached to his opinion is because he's attached his self-worth to that opinion. So if he gets proven wrong, he feels like it's destroyed his self-worth. He has to learn to divorce those two, that just because you're wrong, that doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're worthless. And so he has to learn that being wrong doesn't make you evil or less worthy of respect. We're all wrong from time to time. Let's go into the melancholic soul. I'm going to quote at length from the article again. The melancholic engages the world often in this summary fashion. If I were different, things would be better. The melancholic soul often finds herself in a strange but fantastic concept of her own power. And let me pause for a second. In traditional Catholic philosophy, the soul is always referred to in the feminine. It could be a man or a woman, but the soul is referred to in the feminine because the soul is meant to be a receptacle. There, St. John of the Cross, there are reasons that we go into that. So this could be a man or a woman, but the soul is always referred to in the feminine in traditional Catholic philosophy. We won't get into why, but okay, so resuming the quotation. This soul's mythical belief in self-control needs to be overcome by her will in order to achieve holiness. For example, the fantasy of the melancholic often fuels the notion that by changing sufficiently, i.e., being good enough or loving enough, she can change her external environment. The deception here is a false sense of power. A melancholic needs to accept the fact that in itself her behavior will not change other souls or other external phenomena that affect her. It is a melancholic's self-deception that by doing things perfectly enough, she will one day be appreciated and truly acceptable by others or by God. This perception wreaks havoc on the melancholic spiritual life. Furthermore, the melancholic is extremely sensitive and keenly perceives other people's emotions, especially others' anger and negativity. They usually deal with other people's exaggerated expectations, critiques, or demands with the internal response, I'm bad, I'm the problem, I need to try harder, I'm sorry, it's my fault, should be a sign hung around the neck of the melancholic soul. For her, the only road to acceptance and relatedness is to be the scapegoat of Leviticus. This disposition of the melancholic makes her prone toward absorbing negative emotions until eventually she explodes into an uncontrolled, passionate outburst, usually anger. Besides having unreal expectations of one's effect on others in the world by being good enough, the melancholic also tends to be hard on herself, often obsessing about the evil done and the mistakes made, combined with the characteristic of being crushed by rejection. She is tempted to sacrifice principles or knowledge in order to avoid being rejected or to achieve acceptance. In general, the melancholic can be termed as dependent, or someone who has never really learned to be her own person. The sense of self-agency, I can do this by myself, or my understanding is correct, and thus being free is hampered by the incessant need to please and attach to others in order to receive affection or acceptance. And there's more we could go into, but the melancholic needs to work on truly loving oneself. One of the biggest things you see with melancholics is they tend to blame themselves or take the blame when they're actually not the ones to blame. And they allow the choleric bully to project his own flaws onto the melancholic and blame the melancholic when the melancholic is not actually at fault.
Yeah, very much agree with all that, and I relate to that. As far as actionables that I have tried to take away from this particular dynamic, because I do especially struggle with cholerics in the workplace, is I've told myself the perfectionism really bogs me down. So I've been trying to trade that for fidelity. I set good enough standards for work and I deliver in small reps. I practice exposure to imperfection, like classic exposure therapy, to become more comfortable with that, and also become more comfortable with the self-compassion, which arguably we all should get better at, so that my sense of self-worth is not so tied to this idea of being perfect, which is not possible. And then spiritually, instead of trying to appease people and appease God, turning that into a mode of just receiving grace, gratitude, and that actually I think can be reinforced by some Catholic practices like confession and service. So that can have, for me, helped rewrite that script of is like what you said, is the thing that I repeat to myself subconsciously too much, which is that I'll only be loved or accepted if I get it right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As he points out later in the article, our Lord says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." What that means is the measure of
Mm.
how much you can love your neighbor is first, how much do you love yourself? The melancholic wants to please other people, but that's not the same as loving other people. You have to love yourself first before you can love other people. So the melancholic, because he doesn't love himself, he cannot properly love other people. So he thinks giving other people what they want, appeasing them, like you said, all the time, is loving them. It's actually not. What the melancholic has to do is work up the courage to actually speak the truth around those people and not back down when those people get angry and punish you. Because when someone has a knee jerk emotional angry reaction, they're the one with the problem, not you. Don't absorb their anger and think it's about you. And when you speak the truth in charity, you are actually doing a service. You're helping that person. This is something I think it would be bad advice to tell a choleric to do that because a choleric loves pointing out other people's faults and he thinks he knows everything that's wrong with you and exactly how to fix you. And he loves lecturing and bullying and manipulating other people. So it'd be terrible advice for a choleric. But for a melancholic, melancholic needs to grow a backbone and learn that just because someone has a negative emotion to what you're saying doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. And melancholics are usually very quiet and won't share the very real wisdom that they have because they know other people are just going to get angry. Well, actually, I've learned over time, while it doesn't make it any easier to say it, the fact that other people have a negative, angry, emotional reaction to it probably means what you're saying is very true and very valuable. Otherwise, they wouldn't respond so strongly.